thought I had found my person when I met Jake 7 years ago. He was charming in that effortless way that made me feel like I was the only woman in the room, promising me partnership and a future where we'd build something beautiful together. He talked about providing for us, about being the kind of man who'd take care of his wife. And God help me, I believed every word. Maybe I wanted to believe it so badly that I ignored the little warning signs. The way he'd changed the subject when I asked about his career plans, or how he always had an excuse ready when things didn't go his way. The first time Jake lost his job, I told myself it was just bad luck. Companies downsize, economies shift. These things happen to good people. He seemed genuinely upset about it. Spent a few days moping around our apartment in his pajamas. And I felt terrible for him. When he said he needed some time to figure out his next move, I jumped in to cover our expenses without hesitation. That's what partners do. Right. We support each other through rough patches. I picked up extra shifts at work, cut back on my own spending, and reassured him that we'd get through it together. But weeks turned into months. And Jake's idea of figuring out his next move apparently involved spending entire days on the couch scrolling through his phone. I'd come home exhausted from working 10-hour days to find him exactly where I'd left him that morning, surrounded by empty takeout containers and dirty dishes. When I'd gently suggest he might want to update his resume or check job boards, he'd get defensive and start listing all the ways the job market was impossible. How employers these days wanted unrealistic qualifications. How networking was just a scam for people with connections. The thing about Jake was that he always had to be right about everything. Always, if I mentioned that I'd heard about job openings in his field, he'd explain why those companies were terrible to work for. If I suggested he might want to consider branching out into related industries, he'd lecture me about how I didn't understand his career path. We'd end up in these circular arguments where somehow I'd become the bad guy for trying to be helpful. And eventually I learned it was easier to just nod and agree with whatever he said. Pretending he was right became my default setting because the alternative was hours of exhausting fights that never resolved anything. When Jake finally did find another job, I was so relieved I almost cried. For a while, things felt normal again. We split expenses, went out to dinner occasionally. And I started to believe that maybe the unemployment thing had just been a fluke. I told myself we'd learned from it, that we were stronger as a couple for having weathered that storm together. I was so naive. The second time Jake lost his job, the pattern repeated itself exactly, except this time I recognized it for what it was and felt sick to my stomach. Same excuses, same defensiveness, same expectation that I'd carry the financial burden while he figured things out from the comfort of our couch. Only now I was older and more tired, and the idea of going through months of this again made me want to scream. But what was I supposed to do? Kick him out? Demand he get any job, even one beneath his qualifications? That felt cruel and unsupportive, and I didn't want to be the kind of wife who abandoned her husband when times got tough. So I enabled him again, and I hated myself for it. I hated coming home to find him exactly where I'd left him. Hated the way he'd act like my exhaustion was somehow an attack on his character. Hated that I'd become this bitter, resentful person who fantasized about what life might be like with someone who actually contributed to our household. But I also hated the voice in my head that whispered these things because it felt like a betrayal of my marriage vows. I'd promised to love him for better or worse. And apparently this was the worst part. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening when I walked through our front door after a particularly brutal day at work to find Jake in his usual position on the couch. Except this time, he was laughing at something on his phone while our sink overflowed with dishes and our bills sat unopened on the kitchen counter. Something inside me just snapped. Not into anger, exactly, but into this crystal clear moment of recognition that I couldn't keep living like this without eventually hating him completely. That night, after Jake had gone to bed, I sat at our kitchen table and tried to figure out how to save my marriage. I wasn't thinking about divorce or separation. Not really. I was thinking about how to preserve whatever love we still had before the resentment poisoned it entirely. I needed space to remember why I'd fallen in love with him in the first place. Time to miss him, instead of feeling trapped by him. It seemed so reasonable in my head. The next morning, I waited until Jake had his coffee and seemed approachable before I brought up the idea of a temporary separation. I was careful with my words, emphasizing that this wasn't about ending our marriage, but about giving us both room to reset. I wasn't ending the marriage. I told him, I just needed space. I explained that I wasn't giving up on us. That I was actually trying to save myself before I started hating him. Because once that happened, we'd never find our way back to each other. Jake's reaction was not what I'd expected. Instead of understanding or even sadness, I saw suspicion flash across his face. He wanted to know if there was someone else, if I'd been talking to other men, if this was my way of asking for permission to cheat. The questions felt like slaps, and I found myself defending my fidelity instead of discussing our relationship problems. By the time our conversation ended, Jake was looking at me like I was a stranger, and I felt like I'd somehow made everything worse by trying to be honest. That night, I fell asleep feeling defeated and confused, wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake by opening up about my needs. I had no idea that while I slept, Jake was going through my phone like a detective building a case against me. He found my text conversations with David, a guy I'd met in an online photography group, and apparently decided he'd discovered evidence of a secret affair. David and I had been exchanging friendly messages for months, the kind of casual conversation you have with someone who shares your hobbies. He'd send me good morning texts sometimes, and we'd talk about camera equipment, photography techniques, and our respective jobs. He lived in Maine, for God's sake, and we'd never even met in person. But Jake saw those messages and constructed an entire narrative about my betrayal, complete with romantic implications that existed nowhere but in his imagination. I woke up to Jake standing over me with my phone in his hand, his face twisted with rage and disgust. "I found everything I needed to know," he said, his voice cold and certain. I was still half asleep and confused, trying to understand what he was talking about. When he started reading David's messages aloud in this mocking tone that made innocent conversations sound sordid, "I'm not cheating on you," I said, sitting up in bed and trying to clear my head. "David's just a friend from my photography group. I just need a mental break from us, not another relationship." But Jake was beyond listening to explanations. He called me a liar, accused me of having a full-blown affair, and dismissed everything I said as manipulation and gaslighting. The man I'd been married to for 7 years was looking at me like I was the most disgusting person he'd ever encountered, and nothing I said could penetrate his certainty about my guilt. For 3 weeks after that confrontation, Jake barely spoke to me. We lived in the same house like hostile strangers, and every attempt I made to explain or apologize was met with cold silence or accusations. I kept hoping he'd calm down, and we could have a rational conversation about what had actually happened. But Jake had shut down completely. He decided I was a cheater and a liar, and no evidence to the contrary was going to change his mind. I was making coffee in our kitchen on a Thursday morning when someone knocked on our front door. Jake was already gone, though I hadn't heard him leave, and I figured it was a delivery, or maybe our neighbor. Instead, I found a process server standing on my doorstep with divorce papers that had my name on them. Standing there in my pajamas, holding legal documents that dissolved my marriage, I felt like I was living in someone else's nightmare. Jake hadn't just decided I was guilty of cheating. He'd decided our entire relationship was over and had taken legal action without saying a word to me about it. The man who'd promised to build a life with me had chosen to end our marriage, rather than have one honest conversation about what had actually happened. The next few days were a blur of panic and logistics. Jake made it clear that I needed to move out immediately, and I found myself scrambling to find any apartment I could afford on short notice. I ended up in a depressing one-bedroom place with mismatched furniture and a kitchen barely big enough for one person, signing a lease while still in shock that my life had imploded so quickly. The divorce was finalized faster than I'd thought possible, probably because I was too stunned to fight it effectively. I kept thinking Jake would change his mind, that he'd realize he'd made a terrible mistake and want to work things out. But he was completely committed to his narrative about my betrayal, to him. I wasn't the wife who'd supported him through 2 periods of unemployment and asked for space to save our marriage. I was the cheating wife who'd lied and manipulated and deserved to be discarded. Now I'm living alone in this tiny apartment with just my dog for company, and I spend most evenings trying to figure out how everything went so wrong so fast. I cook dinner for one, watch Netflix by myself, and go to bed in a space that feels nothing like home. Everyone keeps telling me I'm better off without Jake, that I dodged a bullet, that this divorce was actually a blessing in disguise. My sister does this annoying thing where she tilts her head and uses her therapist voice to tell me I deserve better. And my mom launches into lectures about focusing on myself and embracing my independence. But here's what they don't understand. They only know the bad parts because that's what I told them when I was frustrated and needed to vent, and they don't know about the inside jokes Jake and I shared, or how he was the only person who really got my sense of humor, or how comfortable we were together when things were good. They see his unemployment and his accusations as proof that he was a terrible husband. But people go through rough patches. People make mistakes. That's supposed to be what marriage is about. Working through the hard stuff together. Not just giving up the moment things get complicated. I've been thinking a lot about what I could have done differently. Maybe I should have kept my mouth shut about needing space and just dealt with my feelings privately. Maybe I should have been more understanding about Jake's suspicions instead of getting defensive. Maybe I should have cut off contact with David the moment Jake expressed any discomfort, even though the friendship was completely innocent. Being honest about needing space ruined my life. And I can't help but think that if I just kept pretending everything was fine, we'd still be together. The worst part is how alone I feel now. I miss having someone to share my day with. Someone who knows how I like my coffee. Someone whose presence makes a house feel like home. I miss the rhythm of living with another person. Even when that person was driving me crazy, this apartment is so quiet I sometimes turn on the TV just to have background noise. And I've started talking to my dog more than is probably healthy for either of us. I know Jake was hurt by my request for separation. And I know finding those messages with David scared him. But I also know that what we had was real and worth fighting for. And I can't accept that it's really over. Everyone thinks I should move on and embrace my freedom. But they're wrong. Jake and I belong together. We just lost our way for a while. And maybe this divorce was the wake-up call we both needed to remember what we mean to each other. I've been researching ways to reconnect with him, thinking about what I might say if I reached out, wondering if enough time has passed for him to miss me too. I know he's probably still angry, but anger fades. What we built together over 7 years doesn't just disappear because of one misunderstanding. I'm not ready to give up on us, even if everyone else thinks I should. Maybe I'll write him a letter explaining everything more clearly. Or maybe I'll find a way to run into him somewhere we used to go together. I just need the chance to remind him of who we were before everything got so complicated. I need him to remember that I'm not the villain he's made me out to be in his head. I'm the woman who loved him enough to carry us financially when he needed support, who tried to save our marriage by asking for space instead of just walking away, who never actually betrayed him despite his accusations. I refuse to believe that 7 years of marriage can be erased by 3 weeks of misunderstandings and hurt feelings. Jake might think he wants to be divorced, but I know him better than that. I know he misses me too, even if he's too proud or too hurt to admit it. We just need to find our way back to each other, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make that happen. This isn't over. It can't be over. Not like this.